So with that, we come to the Russia and Ukraine conflict. If you can give us a one-liner first on the history of Russia and Ukraine, I'm giving it over to you. Just one-liner, if you could like summarize. I know it's very hard, but
Well, there are two major features here. One is NATO's expansion eastward toward the literal Russian borders, and two is the persecution of the culturally Russian or Russophone population in south and eastern Ukraine, which actually are historical Russian lands. So those two pieces of the puzzle came together, and they're both very, very complex. I mean, you're welcome to have this discussion now if you would like, but that's how I would summarize them. Those are the two pieces that are probably the most relevant to the war in Ukraine, which, for those who don't know, this has been discussed to death, I feel like. It started in 2014, it escalated in 2022, and it's a conflict that's now been going on for 11 years, right? It's not something that began in 2022.
if you can just walk us through what happened from 2014 till now.
Well, I want to go back very briefly to 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Most of the Soviet republics, excluding the Baltics and parts of the Caucasus, voted to stay within the Soviet Union. So this is one of those things that's very easily locatable in, like basic history of that period. But people seem to forget that that dissolution was against most people's wishes. But be that as it may, in the 1990s, the former Soviet republics, Russia and Ukraine especially, were in a state of collapse. It was a time when there were attempts to implement very dramatic and very rapid neoliberal reforms that created financial crises, hyperinflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So every negative consequence that you can imagine, from starvation to the rise of terrorism to the decline of birth rates, et cetera, it was present in both of these places. But at that time, a lot of NGOs moved in coming from the West, big NGOs that you can think of like USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, also ones coming from Europe as well, backed by, I mean, nominally they're independent, but of course they're getting funding from various government organizations. So it's kind of funny to call them independent. But nonetheless, they moved in and they started funding the so-called civil society. Now, when you're funding civil society, it sounds really nice on paper. It sounds like you're trying to create maybe pluralism, diverse points of view, but in reality, a lot of these organizations were trying to create in Ukraine. I would call it Project Anti-Russia, trying to use certain historical issues that were relevant to only one part of Ukraine, let's say in the West, where anti-Russian sentiment way in the West was present. Those are parts of Ukraine that were under Austria-Hungary and parts of Poland, many centuries ago. And so basically kind of trying to amplify a very small regional nationalism and apply it to the whole country. And so in 2004, there was an Orange Revolution. This was sort of the first attempt to bring to power a leader that was more West focused, which, his name was Yushchenko. He's married to an Ukrainian American, so there was that connection as well. But the changes in terms of society were not as dramatic. Now, in 2014 and 2013, 2014, in my opinion, this was the second attempt that was successful. It turned into a violent regime change. Officially, Ukraine calls it a revolution of dignity, which is kind of a unusual name to use for something that was so violent and in fact led to a civil war that then escalated into the current conflict between NATO and Russia, with Ukraine being basically used as the area where the conflict is taking place, and Ukrainians are being used as cannon fodder. But basically in 2014, there was what a lot of people would concluded was not a revolution. Now, of course, there were grievances against every government. If you go back and look, every I think there was maybe 5 or so presidents starting from the 90s, and They were all accused of corruption. There were protests against every single president. So this was nothing new. And of course, every country you can find some kind of grievances against the government. But usually these so-called color revolutions, they need something, some kind of fertile soil, right, to have unrest grow out of it, right? And that unrest may or may not be engineered, right? In the Ukrainian case, it was both. And so without going into too much detail, the legitimate president was overthrown in winter 2014. This is when Russia basically used its naval base in Crimea, used that opportunity because it was being rented, and took over Crimea. The Western media calls it an annexation, which I guess technically it is, but Crimea had been Russian since the late 1700s. The majority of the population there is Russian. There's been multiple referenda since the 1990s, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, in terms of either being autonomous or joining Russia. They're easily accessible online. So this was not anything that was just surprising and new. But then Ukraine launched the so-called anti-terrorist operation in the east and the south, basically calling the protesters against this new regime. These protesters did not acknowledge this regime. They did not perceive it as a legitimate government. This is when the war really began. And so it was pretty bloody. Western media, CNN, BBC initially covered it actually surprisingly fair. I mean, it wasn't really ideal, but a lot of those clips are still floating online. It's nothing like the way the current iteration of the war in Ukraine is being covered. So it's almost amusing that you can go back 10 years and see the coverage and how different it is versus what's being said now. I guess the expectation is that the average news consumer has the attention span of maybe a couple of weeks, which I don't necessarily think it's true, but I think some people just are more focused on, their daily grind as opposed to, thinking about foreign policy. But be that as it may. And so that conflict was very bloody. The initial numbers, I think I don't remember the exact date, but for maybe the first 6, 7, or even 8 years of the conflict, if you look at the UN numbers, the total casualties were in the 50,000. Now it included both sides, and the civilian deaths were in a few thousands. And then, of course, the question of civilian versus military is tricky because a lot of people who were civilian went to volunteer in the army. So they were sort of no longer civilian, but they were not professional military either. But be that as it may, all of these human rights organizations in the UN documented the extent of the carnage, which is why early on in 2014 and 2015, Russia under Putin, as well as Germany under Angela Merkel, and France, back then it was under Hollande, and Belarus was involved as well. These negotiations took place in Minsk, and of course Ukraine. They came up with Minsk Agreements. So there were sort of two versions of these agreements. All kinds of things needed to be fulfilled on both sides. OSCE was supposedly watching the fulfillment of the whole list of issues that came up. But then much more recently, we've learned that both from the former President Poroshenko in Ukraine, from Angela Merkel when she was no longer in power, and as well as Hollande, he was no longer in power either, that these agreements were basically used to arm Ukraine and to train them to NATO standards instead of actually create a long-lasting peace that's respectful of the different ethnicities, different languages, and religions that exist in Ukraine. And this led to the launch of the special military operation. There was this huge escalation. If you actually look at the shooting that was taking place in December, January, there's just this massive rise.
Yeah. Before I'm sorry to cut you off, Nina. Before we get into that, could you give us an idea how the demography of Ukraine looks like geographically? Any insights?
So Ukraine is sort of this strange animal that inherited the Soviet borders. Now, within the Soviet Union, there were administrative borders. Obviously, no one thought that the Soviet Union would dissolve. And within that, this new geopolitical entity, right, in the 1920s, first, the Bolsheviks gave Ukraine large chunks of Russian land, basically land that was not just Russian speaking, but ethnically Russian. Obviously, ethnic Russians and Ukrainians are very close to begin with. Orthodox Christians. Obviously, the Soviet Union was nominally atheist, but that doesn't mean that religion wasn't being practiced behind the scenes. But be that as it may, so Donbass, which is where the war started, as well as sort of parts of the southeast, were attached administratively to Ukraine. There was also this idea of training sort of new communist specialists, because remember, this was a new entity, right? It was considered to be hostile by all the Europeans that were around it, right? There was a bloody civil war after the Russian Revolution. The newly established Soviet Union was very weak. So it needed to, not everyone supported the Bolshevik government that came to power, right? After the Tsar abdicated, there was sort of this interim government. And so there was a bloody civil war to establish this government, right? So not everyone supported it. So how do you gain mass support from the population? Well, one way that the early Bolsheviks, starting from Vladimir Lenin, thought would be to create these new specialists that would basically become bureaucrats in the system at various levels. And one way to do that is sort of to promote local ethno-nationalism. So that would be language, that would be publication of books. And in some places, those were real ethnicities that did have the language, et cetera, et cetera. But in other places, it was something that was being almost created out of nowhere. And it was being promoted in places, let's say Ukraine may have had Russian speakers that were now having to learn Ukrainian that they never had to speak before. So it was a very clumsy process, but it had this practical purpose of basically having more communist bureaucrats that would support the new system in the 1920s. And throughout its history, the Soviet Union promoted these ethno-nationalism, or I guess you can call them maybe cultural, ethno-linguistic nationalism. I mean, it depended on the region. And it promoted it to the extent where when it came to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it's almost like the Soviet Union already had these little ethnic enclaves that could be separated into separate states, except they were not free economically. They were integrated into the Soviet Union. So it was a policy that basically ended up biting back, and it had a very negative impact. And so this is something that is to be noted here in terms of the regions that were attached to what would have been considered Ukraine, which would have been way, way, way more west. Crimea was given to Ukraine, again, administratively as a gift in the 1950s. So again, no one really thought the Soviet Union would collapse. It was something that was attached, like transferred within this big, this geopolitical entity. And so in terms of what Ukraine is today, people who live way, way, way west used to be under either Austria-Hungary or Poland. Now remember, Poland was also partitioned 3 times. And so there was a lot of sort of going back and forth during the around World War I and the Russian Revolution. The Germans were there, so they controlled that area briefly. So they were sort of not really controlled by Russians since maybe the Middle Ages. So that part of Ukraine is more of its own ethnicity. I would call those people Ukrainians as opposed to the ones that live in the center in the east. Now, obviously, when you live in a Soviet republic and modern Ukraine post-1991, people move around. So it's kind of hard to say how many of them stayed here and there. There have been studies demographically, but I would say the minority in the West would be ethnic Ukrainians. And there also some of them would practice different religion, not Russian Orthodoxy. It's like Greek Catholicism. So it's still Christianity, but it's a very, very different brand. And there are all kinds of religious tensions going back to the 1500s in that part of the country versus center and the east and the south. But be that as it may, let's say you do have this Frankenstein state that came out of the Soviet Union. You can make it functional as long as you reasonably respect everyone's language rights, which was the case initially, but it really started declining even before the Orange Revolution. It was just a gradual decline, and it escalated after 2014 just dramatically.
A lot of people might not know Russia is a very, very diverse state. You got a lot of type of people there living together. So what does the history between NATO and Russia look like? I know these are very, very big questions, but if you could like just walk us through real quick.
Well, NATO was established at the height of the Cold War, right, in 1949, and the famous quote coming from one of its then leaders, it was established to keep the Russians out and the Germans down. So many, many decades later, you can kind of see that the Russians are still out and the Germans are kept down. So it's a pretty interesting way to perceive it. But initially, at least looking at the geopolitics of the Cold War, right, you had this duopoly, and the justification for NATO's establishment was to challenge and contain the Soviet Union, sort of tagging on to the American foreign policy of containment coming out of World War II. Let's not forget the USSR, Britain, and the US were allies in World War II. Somehow it all worked together. If you actually look at their cooperation, it's really interesting because Stalin had a much easier time actually dealing with Roosevelt on the US side than with Churchill. Churchill was very difficult to deal with and was, you can probably call him a bit anti-Russian to say the least. So it's actually really interesting how that dynamic changed after the end of World War II, with Truman specifically, that had to become president when Roosevelt passed away. And so the Americans made their foreign policy global, right? When you're establishing in the 1940s this policy of containment, of supposedly having this threat of communism spreading everywhere, then it has to be done on a global scale, which was, I guess, from the perspective on Washington, it made sense because the US came out as a superpower of World War II, so it now had the capacity to implement that. Unfortunately, in Europe, that idea of containment, I guess from the American perspective, was working reasonably well. When it came to other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, there were a lot, or Africa for that matter, there were a lot of these independence movements coming out of European colonialism that had less to do with the Soviet Union and had more to do with basically dismantling the colonial structures that were in place for decades, if not centuries. And in many cases, like in Vietnam, for example, the people would opt for something that was more along the lines of socialism instead of Americanized liberal capitalism. And that was being perceived by the US as a threat and a way for the Soviet Union to expand, which was not even necessarily true. But of course, then the Soviet Union would react to American actions, as it often did, and there would be that escalation. But going back to Europe, from the Washington perspective, NATO made sense. Europe was sort of split, along the so-called Iron Curtain. It made sense to contain the Soviet Union. And then I say this as someone who is obviously a Russian and a fan of Russia, but from their perspective, you can kind of understand that NATO did have a reason to exist. A little bit later, Russia or the Soviet Union launched its own version of NATO, which was the Warsaw Pact. However, at the end of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union was dissolving, there was no reason to keep the Warsaw Pact because the naive assumption coming from certain Soviet and then first Russian leader is that we're now going to be friends. And the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, and Russia pulled out of all the places where it had military presence, first and foremost, East Germany. And then, of course, the American side did none of that, right? NATO had a little bit of a existential crisis in the 1990s because it no longer had a reason to exist in the sense of having this external opponent or enemy, if you'd like. But it pretty quickly found other ways to operate. It got involved in the Balkan Wars, which in some ways some would claim instigated. In 1999, obviously, NATO illegally bombed parts of today's Serbia, right, then the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, one of the iterations of the post Soviet. Obviously, Yugoslavia was not technically in that in the Soviet bloc, but it was sort of allied to a certain extent. And so NATO was looking for reasons to exist, and as some analysts, some intellectuals say, it creates reasons to exist by creating crises and then responding to these crises. I believe Richard Sakwa's quote is quite relevant here. And so it's sort of this, vicious cycle. And I'm sure the intellectuals behind NATO know what they're doing, right? There is a reason why they're doing this. It's about it, some would say it's about geopolitical control. Others would say it's about benefiting the so-called military-industrial complex that makes money in this way. You cannot just dismantle this organization. But anyway, this is sort of the idea of NATO, why NATO just did not disappear like the Warsaw Pact, but it started moving eastward. Now, perhaps the initial members that joined NATO maybe made sense, but when it started moving closer and closer towards Russian borders, and this organization that claims to be defensive and is in fact quite offensive, as we saw with the bombing of Yugoslavia, that is problematic. But whenever there is some kind of an analyst who tries to make the point that if a hostile military alliance were moving towards American borders, they would react a lot quicker. That's usually dismissed because they think that, well, they are powerful, they can react if they want. Russia is not so powerful, it cannot react. So it's sort of this, what's allowed for Jupiter is not allowed for the bull, right? That Latin expression. And so obviously Russia attempted to, now nothing was really in writing, but when it comes to these agreements, if you look at, for instance, the Minsk Agreements, those were in writing and no one really, gave a damn about them. So in the end, there was a lot of documentation that verbally this was being discussed and that there was this understanding that, yes, we probably should not move this close to Russian borders because why antagonize this, this large country with a large nuclear arsenal? But obviously, some geniuses decided that it doesn't really matter. We can do whatever we want. We are on the side of the superpower, and the rest is history. Once NATO started to move into Ukraine, now officially it didn't, but there are lots of rumors about NATO wanting to use Crimea as its base, because that would have been just a huge, punch in the face of Russia. This was a, land that belonged to Russia for almost 300 years. It's part of Russian military glory when it came to multiple wars and World War II especially. And so this would have been symbolically just extremely detrimental. And that's one of the explanations for why Putin acted so quickly in 2014 and just annexed this land, basically did something that no one was really expecting him to do. But I would say that there's been multiple attempts to be nice. I think initially Russia tried to even join NATO. I'm not sure what was the thinking behind that because I have my opinions about that. But nothing came of it. So there was that attempt to
What's your
be,
opinion?
friendly and amicable.
What's your opinion? Yeah.
Well, if you look at it from the standpoint of classic geopolitics, NATO is an organization that is run by maritime countries, and Russia is a land power just like China. So it doesn't really make sense to join this organization that's designed to push around in a best case scenario or dominate land powers, right? So it really made no sense. But be that as it may, there was a lot of amicable behavior and I would say just rolling over in the 1990s, in part because the leaders were naive, but also because I think they really did perceive that the Cold War is over. They kind of fell for, for the idea that we can now be friends and we can just trade. And you were hearing this a lot coming from the first Clinton administration and the second Clinton administration while NATO was expanding. But if you go back, there's been multiple attempts to come to a reasonable resolution. I think Putin's 2007 Munich speech, where he was critical of this unipolar world, is probably one of the most famous examples, and it just kept being ignored. So if you think about this NATO encroachment from the standpoint of like poking the bear, right, it happened for almost 3 decades until Russia actually reacted. That's really, really patient. Any other major country in its position, first and foremost the US, would have reacted a lot sooner.
So NATO just got together in Hague and pushed up their military spendings, I think, by 5%, which is quite a lot. That might also be taken as a threat by Russia.
Well, I don't know how they're going to do this, considering that a lot of the economies in the EU, and the EU is sort of like the face of NATO. It's, some people perceive them as, almost interchangeably, even though technically they're separate entities, right? One is supposed to be this sort of economic union, but also it's sort of become a cultural union, open borders within the EU, and then NATO is the military alliance, but a lot of people perceive them as quite interchangeable. And I think if you look at some of these bureaucrats that go from one to the other, that kind of shows it that it's the same elites that are being appointed and moved around within this entity, so to speak, specifically in Europe. But from the American perspective, now NATO, some people would say NATO is the U.S. Look at how much money they're spending on NATO. It's I don't remember if it's like 75%. It was a huge number compared to the other countries. And so from the American perspective, I think Trump's argument was that, well, they need to sort of pull their own weight. Why should we defend them? And that's also kind of funny because defending means having military bases in these countries. I'm not sure if they're actually defending or if they're there to make sure that the orders from the center of the empire are being followed. You can interpret this however you want. But based on the European situation economically, I mean, a lot of countries like Germany took a huge downturn, first and foremost because of the Russian energy question, but there are other issues within the EU as well. So it's kind of hard to imagine that they would be able to fund something like that. But from the standpoint of propaganda, well, of course, there's so much propaganda, war propaganda, and Russia will take over half of Europe if we don't do this in order to justify this type of military spending.